Her father gave her to a mountain man as punishment for getting pregnant. He treated her like no one. It was dusk when the mountain began to breathe. The wind slid down its spine like an old hymn, rustling the pine needles and whispering past the wooden porch of a cabin that stood alone, far from the town, far from anyone's memory. Smoke curled out of the chimney like a tired exhale, as if the earth itself had grown weary. Inside, the cabin held little: a cot, a stove, a table made of dark cedar, and a man with a beard the color of snowmelt. His name was Elijah. He did not speak much anymore. He listened, to the wind, to the cracking fire, to the ache in his bones that reminded him of winters long buried and words never said. That evening, something moved at the edge of the trail. A wagon. Not the kind that brought supplies or letters. This one carried silence and shame. A man stepped out, rigid, suited, jaw clenched, and he did not look at Elijah when he spoke. "She's yours now." He said it like tossing a bone to a dog. Then he turned without explanation, left the girl standing there like a frostbitten sapling, and drove away. The wheels echoed down the narrow path and then faded, and the silence returned. She looked no older than 17. Her dress was thin, creased with dust. Her hands were folded tight against her stomach, but her eyes, wide, frightened, and almost feral, were what stayed with Elijah. She had no bag, no shoes, fit for the cold. A bruise bloomed near her collarbone like a wilted flower, and her lip was cracked. She didn't speak. Neither did he. He simply opened the door, stepped back, and let her choose. She walked in, slow, unsure. The firelight kissed her face like it hadn't been touched in months. He didn't ask her name. He didn't need it. Names were for men who wanted to own things. Elijah just laid a folded quilt on the cot across from his, poured warm water into a basin, and slid it gently across the table. She looked at it like it might burn her. Then, after a pause long enough for night to settle fully, she dipped her fingers in. Outside, the mountain watched, ancient, unmoved, but listening. That first night, Elijah didn't sleep. He sat in the corner chair beside the fire, his body still as the mountain outside, the only movement the slow blinking of his eyes and the steady rise and fall of his chest. The girl had curled into the cot like a creature unsure of its right to rest, her frame tense beneath the quilt, as though the softness might turn cruel in her sleep. At some point past midnight she coughed, a dry, shallow sound. Elijah stood, filled a cup with warm water, and set it quietly near her hand without a word. She didn't reach for it, but in the morning the cup was empty. He chopped wood just before dawn. The axe rang through the trees, not in rage but rhythm, one of the few things that made sense anymore. When he returned, she was sitting at the table, hands wrapped around the mug he'd left. Her hair, once knotted and fallen around her face, was now braided down her back, uneven, but neat. There was something about the braid that told him she'd been raised in a house where appearance mattered more than feeling. He saw her glance at the window each time the wind stirred, like she expected someone to arrive, someone she feared, or maybe hoped would change their mind. He made cornbread and stew that night. She didn't eat until he walked out onto the porch, giving her space. When he returned, half the bowl was gone. She'd folded the napkin beside it. Little things, each day, small things. A nod instead of silence. A glance that lingered 1 second longer than fear required. He found her staring at the bookshelf once, her fingers tracing the spine of a worn poetry volume. He didn't say anything, just left it by her cot the next morning. A week passed, then another. Sometimes when she lifted her sleeves to reach for the kettle or brush cinders from the hearth, Elijah noticed faint marks along her arms, old bruises, barely fading. Once, when she bent to pick up a fallen spoon, he saw a line of scar tissue along her lower back, thin as thread, but too precise to be accidental. He didn't ask, he wouldn't. The mountain taught him long ago, wounds that aren't spoken of aren't ready to be healed. They must be seen first, only seen. One night, snow blew hard against the window panes. The cold crept in through the planks like a forgotten warning. Elijah stoked the fire higher, then quietly placed another quilt beside her cot. She looked up at him, really looked, and for the first time, her voice emerged, cracked and unsure. "Why are you being kind?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her the way he looked at the trees, patient, steady. Then he said, "Because no one was, when I needed it." She didn't cry, not then, but she looked away and pulled the quilt over her shoulder like it meant something sacred. That night, the cabin felt warmer than it should have. Not from the fire, from the silence that finally softened. It was the third Sunday after she arrived when Elijah first heard her speak more than a few words. The snow had softened into drizzle, and the path behind the cabin was slick with wet leaves. He was tending to the trap lines in silence when he saw her outside, sitting on the stump near the woodshed, staring into the fog like it held something only she could see. She didn't flinch when he approached, nor did she look up, but she spoke, almost in a whisper, her voice lost in the mist. "He told me I shamed the family, said the baby was proof I was ruined." Elijah didn't respond. He never interrupted memory when it chose to rise. "He made me kneel in front of the elders," she continued. "Told them what I did, what he said I did. But he didn't tell them he was the one who locked the door, or that he was the one who came back when my mother wasn't home." Elijah closed his eyes. A silence spread between them, vast and holy. She turned to him slowly. "He was my cousin." Then she looked down at her hands, as if afraid of what they might still remember. "And I was 14. Elijah didn't ask about the baby. He didn't need to. The way her hand curled protectively against her abdomen even now told the truth. It hadn't stayed with her, either taken or lost. Perhaps both. The days after that confession changed the way Elijah watched her. Not with pity, but with reverence, the way one might observe a tree still standing after lightning. He noticed the way she folded napkins with precision, how she double-knotted her shoes even when she wasn't leaving. These were not habits of carelessness, but survival, traces of someone trained to be invisible and still punished for being seen. One afternoon, the silence broke. A rider approached, not loud, not violent, but certain. A town sheriff, dressed in a long tan coat and boots, too clean for mountain soil. His eyes scanned the porch, then found Elijah splitting kindling. "Looking for a girl," he said plainly. "Father reported her runaway, said she's with a man in these parts, a mountain man." The last words carried the weight of scorn. Elijah said nothing, just nodded toward the firewood. "She's only 17, the sheriff continued. "Pregnant. Could ruin a man's name, letting her stay." Behind the curtain, she stood still as a stone. Elijah set down the axe slowly. He walked to the edge of the porch, looked the man in the eye, and said only one thing. "A man's name is ruined long before a girl runs." The sheriff didn't reply. He wasn't there for truth, just the appearance of it. After a pause, he mounted his horse and rode off. No warrant, no violence, just the cold weight of something unspoken. That night she lit the fire without being asked. She didn't ask Elijah if she was safe, because something in his silence had already answered. But before turning in, she looked at him once more and said, "My name is Clara." He nodded, a softness in his throat he couldn't name. "Elijah," he replied, as if his name too had only now returned. Winter clung to the mountain like an old regret. Snow no longer fell soft. It scraped. Icy winds turned breath to ghosts, and the trees stood stripped and bare, watching. The world was no longer just between Clara and Elijah now. It had begun to listen. The mule deer no longer darted when Clara came near. Instead, they watched from the ridge, still as stone. A red fox passed by the cabin one morning, stopping mid-step to stare at her through the frost-glazed window before vanishing into the pines. Even the crows grew quieter, circling overhead with a measured grace, not menace. It felt as if nature itself had taken pause, not judging, not protecting, simply witnessing. Elijah sensed it first, a shift in the air, in the rhythm of the woods. Letters began to arrive, brought by a post rider who didn't speak much, but always looked too long at the cabin before leaving. Then came the whisperers, townspeople from the valley who pretended to come for pelts or firewood, but lingered with eyes too sharp, voices too rehearsed. One woman, with skin like parchment and a gaze that bit, asked outright, "That girl, she yours?" Elijah didn't answer. He simply handed her the bag of dried herbs she had requested and returned to splitting logs. Clara stood behind the curtain, quiet, watching the woman ride off with her question unanswered. Later that evening, as the fire breathed against the cabin's ribs, Clara asked, "Do they hate you for keeping me?" Elijah stirred the stew slowly, then said, They don't hate what they don't understand, but they fear it, and fear's colder than snow. She nodded, though her shoulders tightened. The silence that followed was not empty. It was expectant, the kind of silence that settles before a storm. The world was waiting to see which way this would bend. The preacher came next, thin as wire, eyes like dull knives. He rode up uninvited and leaned his Bible on Elijah's porch rail, as though it gave him claim. "What you're doing," he said, "it ain't right in the eyes of decent folk." Elijah didn't flinch. "And what about the eyes of God?" The preacher's lips curled like he'd tasted iron. "God watches too. He sees all things. He sees the filth we try to sanctify." Inside the cabin, Clara stood by the fire, unmoving. Elijah stepped between the preacher and the door. "Then let him be the one to strike me down," he said. "You can go." The preacher didn't argue. He left, not with fury, but with the cold triumph of a man who believes time will do his work for him. Days passed. The sky darkened earlier. The wind howled less like wind and more like breath. Elijah kept hunting, chopping, warming stew. Clara sewed buttons on his worn coat one afternoon and didn't explain why. He didn't ask. Stillness blanketed everything now, a thick, aching stillness. Yet beneath it, emotion churned. The mountain had become a chapel. Trees stood like sentinels. The stream near the trail gurgled quieter, as if whispering a secret. There was no crowd, no torches or mobs, but a verdict was forming, not of guilt, but of grace. The world was watching, yes, but not for judgment. It was waiting for a man to stand where another might run, for a girl to be seen where others were hidden, for silence to hold, rather than break. It happened on a night when even the fire hesitated to burn. The coals dimmed in their cradle, casting more memory than light. A hush blanketed the cabin so deep it seemed even the floorboards held their breath. Outside, snow fell sideways, pushed by a wind too tired to howl. Clara sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold. Her eyes were fixed on the door, but her thoughts were elsewhere, buried in a place neither flame nor time could reach. Elijah was sharpening a blade in the corner, slow and methodical, not for use, but for rhythm. That's when she said it, barely a whisper. "I tried to end it. Twice." The sound scraped the silence. Elijah stopped, turned to her. He didn't speak. She wasn't done. Once with a belt, once with the cold. "I walked into the woods barefoot, thought maybe the mountain would take me before they did." Her voice cracked, not with tears, but exhaustion. She wasn't crying. She had done enough of that, in rooms that had no windows. "I kept thinking," she went on, "that maybe if I disappeared, they'd forget. That if I died, I'd die clean. But I kept waking up, alive, angry, and so tired." She looked up, and something in her gaze, hollow and wild but defiant, forced Elijah to kneel without knowing why. He sank to the floor slowly, not out of pity, not to console, but because standing felt like a lie in the face of that truth. His eyes, so long dulled by solitude, brimmed with something unfamiliar. "Don't kneel for me," Clara said. "I'm not," Elijah replied. "I'm kneeling because I never did for myself." She blinked, startled. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was shared. He reached into the drawer beneath the stove and pulled out a small object wrapped in a cloth. Unfolding it carefully, he revealed a simple wooden carving. A deer, no bigger than a hand, its form graceful, unfinished. He passed it to her without explanation. "My father carved one just like this," he said, "when I was little. Gave it to me before he left for good. I've kept it all these years. Thought it would remind me who I was." She traced the deer's back with a fingertip, gently, as though she were waking it. "You can have it," Elijah added. "You've earned your name back." Clara didn't thank him. She simply held the carving to her chest, and for the first time since arriving on that mountain, she let her body fall forward, into his shoulder, into the warmth, into something that wasn't shame. He didn't hold her like a father or a lover. He held her like a witness, like someone who knew the sacred weight of staying. And outside, beneath the snow-heavy sky, the mountain listened without judgment. Spring came like a held breath, finally exhaled. The snow receded in shy curves down the mountainside, and green returned, slow, cautious, like it was testing the world again. Birds returned first. Then the creek began to hum beneath the thaw. And finally Clara began stepping farther from the cabin. She walked barefoot sometimes, letting the moss and mud remind her she was still alive. Elijah watched without intruding. Marking the quiet strength in her shoulders, she no longer flinched at every gust of wind. She was gathering herbs near the tree line when her body faltered. A stumble, then another. By dusk, her skin burned with fever, and her breath came shallow, as if her lungs refused to draw from the same world that had once betrayed her. Elijah placed cool cloths on her forehead, crushed mint leaves in boiling water, and sat beside her cot through the night, whispering stories to the fire more than to her. For 3 days, she drifted between fever, dreams, and silence. On the 4th morning, her eyes opened, clouded but aware, and her fingers reached for the wooden deer on the nightstand. Elijah knew then she would not vanish. Not this time. She was still recovering when the horse returned. The sound of hooves against thawed soil cut through the air like old thunder. Elijah stepped onto the porch, and there he was, her father. No hat, no rider's dust on his shoulders, just the same stiff jaw and pressed collar. But something was different. The fury was gone. He looked older now, not in years but in weight, like a man undone by the emptiness of his own making. Clara stood in the doorway behind Elijah, pale, steady. "I came," the man said, not as a statement, but as if trying to believe it himself. "I heard you were alive." No one answered. "I wanted to see what was left of you." Clara stepped forward, leaning on the frame for balance. Her voice, though hoarse, was clear. "I'm not what's left. I'm what's left you." He blinked, stunned. "You've changed." "I had to," she said. "You gave me away like an object, but I became a person here." Her father's hands trembled slightly, not from anger, from something older, maybe regret, maybe recognition. "I thought I was doing what was right," he muttered, half to her, half to the wind. "Keeping things respectable. You were protecting your name," she said. "But I was the one who lived with it." He looked at Elijah then, searching for accusation or permission. But Elijah just stood still, eyes quiet, offering no judgment, only truth. "She's not yours anymore," he said. Maybe she never was. There was no shouting, no fists, just a long silence that finally told the truth louder than any sermon. The father left without another word. But the town began to change. Word spread, not of scandal, but survival. Clara began receiving letters, small parcels, a bar of soap from an old schoolteacher, a stitched handkerchief from the baker's daughter. Even the preacher's wife sent dried lavender in a brown envelope, unsigned. No one said they were sorry, but they said something quieter. "We see you now." That spring, Clara planted a row of marigolds beneath the porch. Elijah carved a second wooden deer and placed it beside hers. And though they said little, something had shifted. In the town, in the trees, in them. Sometimes, healing doesn't arrive with justice. Sometimes, it returns as breath. The years passed not with thunder, but with quiet. Seasons folded into one another like worn pages in a book no one had the heart to close. The mountain, ever watchful, seemed softer now, its winds no longer accused, its silence no longer a cage. Life, as it does, moved forward, but not without memory. Clara stayed, not because she had nowhere to go, but because she had already arrived. She began to teach small things to the valley children who wandered up the trail with curiosity in their eyes. How to listen to birdsong, how to braid lavender into ribbon, how to press wildflowers between book pages so they'd remember spring in the middle of winter. Elijah grew slower, but lighter. He spoke more, not often, but enough. Sometimes he would sit on the porch, watching the sun dissolve behind the ridgeline, the wooden deer resting on the rail beside him, now joined by a third, smaller, carefully carved. When Clara's belly grew round the following summer, no one whispered, no one turned away. The woman at the post office sent her hand-knit booties in an envelope marked, "For what matters." The baker added honey to her bread without being asked. Even the preacher nodded once from across the creek when their paths crossed, tipping his hat without a word. When the child came, a girl with Elijah's stillness and Clara's eyes, the mountain did not stir. It simply received her, as if it had always known she would arrive. They named her June, After the month, the frost finally broke. A blanket hung on the cabin wall, stitched with marigolds and deer, each thread a quiet testimony. It was Clara's work, her way of writing a story that didn't need paper. The carving Elijah had once given her rested above the hearth, smooth from being held too often. Time didn't erase what happened, but it did something better. It layered love over pain until the shape changed, until the scars no longer stung but taught. Clara often said little about the years before Elijah's porch. She didn't need to. Her silence was no longer hiding. It was peace. One day a traveler came through the valley looking for firewood and direction. He saw the child playing in the wildflowers and asked who she was. The townspeople answered plainly, without ceremony. She belongs to a woman who was once given away, and to a man who never asked for her name, only gave her back her dignity. The traveler didn't understand. He didn't have to, because sometimes the world shifts not with war, but with a hand held steady, and the choice to stay when no one would have blamed you for walking away.